Ready to go?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody. We've got a big crowd this morning. This is the first actual mini clinic, and we have mini clinics scheduled now for a few weeks. Next week, it'll be Steve Antonucci, and he will be demonstrating how to make a hollow-in system for $10 or less. And then we've got a bunch, and I've got phone calls to make to some of you, asking you to volunteer to do a mini clinic. So my setup today is I've got the main camera that I'm speaking to now is my cell phone, and I've got a laptop that's muted with the sound down where I can see what you're seeing. So hopefully if I hold something up, you'll be able to see it okay. I'm going to spend most of the time in front of the table, but I will spend a little bit of time on the lathe, just doing a little bit of turning, and I've got I'll move my camera over for that. So first thing we're going to do is take a look, and I'm just going to switch the camera around. I'm going to take a look at some of the examples of flat-sided vessels. In the information I sent out, I talked about a class with Frank Penta and Andy Gunning at John C. Campbell, and this was the final day. This was the kind of stuff that we were making, and I basically just started turning, so this was a bit scary for me, but I made 3 or 4 of these large platters. This particular one has multi-axis turning in the base, indexing, texturing with the Sorby texturing tool, learning a lot of new things. But on the last day, I asked Andy Gunning, I said, I woke up in the night thinking I want to make an octagonal platter, and talked to him. He said, well, it's not on the schedule, but go for it. And this was the result. I was really happy with the outcome. I didn't really know much about scallops and how to maximize them, but I did a lot of fancy work. I used a recess or a mortise, which I would say 90% of the demos products I make have a recess, and I generally try to doctor the recess to look like it wasn't there to make the platter. This is my latest flat-sided vessel, and as you can see, it's a really nice tiger wood. It's 18 inches in diameter, and it's what I call my bowl within a bowl.
Wow.
Typically, center, then it comes out to a platter with the scallops you see here, and nothing fancy about it. I doctored up the recess a little bit. In this case, the recess is maybe 3/16 deep at the most. I tend not to go very deep with my recesses. I think it looks better that way. The finish I used is a third that I mix up myself, but I haven't buffed it or anything. It's just had 3 or 4 coats of the wipe on finish, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Here are some other examples of flat-sided vessels I've done. Some of them have fairly steep sides, and some of them are very flat. This one is very flat, so you'll see that there is very little in the way of a scallop. But this is hand-carved 3-dimensional to give it that look of a 3-dimensional platter. Here's another one where I've done flat sides, but I've done every other to try and give it a different kind of look. This one, it's 2014, I did that one. And I guess somebody is not muted.
Yep. Please turn off your, I'm going to mute everybody.
Okay, thanks. This is the one that we're going to be basically doing today. This one has 16 flat sides, and you can see that there's a small scallop, a nice even flow in shape.
Bob, you got to remember to put him back.
I know, I'm working on it. He's on there twice. Oh, we can't hear him. Hold on a second, Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, now we got you.
Yeah, I was muted. You must have muted me when you
I did.
muted everybody.
I did. Yeah, I muted everybody and then I had to unmute you. It took me a second to go through the list.
All right. I don't know if we saw this. This is what we're going to be basically making today. This one's got 16. I think the one on the lathe will have 12 facets or 12 flat sides. Typically, I start out with a square block, square blank. I use dry wood. This is some cherry that I bought from one of the members that Bob had listed last year, I think. It's about 9 inches. So I cut it square on the chop saw, and I try to get everything as precise as possible when I'm working with stuff like this, because precision is important, or your scallops will not look nice and even. This one is cut. It's concave on the bottom, so I always work with the concave surface down, because when you do any cutting, you have the opportunity to have it, you know, not rock. What I do sometimes, I run it through my jet drum sander, 1632, so it'll do 16 inches in one cut. Probably one of the best tools I've ever purchased is the jet drum sander. But I'll run it through and flatten it so there's no rocking when I'm cutting. One of the questions that you have to decide is, how many flat sides do I want that would look right? You know, in this case, we're talking about 16. And if you went much less than much more than 16 for this diameter, this facet would be so small you wouldn't really see the scallop. So I decided to make this. This one was a very interesting one to turn, actually. You can see that it varies from 4 to 5 to 6 to 8 to 12 to 16 to 18 and to 32 sides. And I thought this would help us to understand the impact of the size of the flat, you know, this length here. And of course, the diameter or the radius of the part has an impact on how defined the scallops will be. And if you have, the bigger the diameter, the thinner you have to turn the wood here to get the scallop effect. In this case, I'm at less than 1/8 of an inch on this thickness. Here, you could be 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, and you'd still have the scallop. But when you get to about here, you've got to really have a very thin wall to get the scallop effect. So how many sides? I think if you have more sides than the diameter of the workpiece, in this case 9 diameter, I think if you get much more than 1.5 times the diameter in the number, here we're 8, here we're 12, 16, there's almost no scallop at all. It depends, you know, how pronounced you want the scallop to be. So I would say the options for a 9-inch are probably 12 is a nice number. 8 is not bad. So somewhere between 8 and 12. So somewhere 1 to 1.3 times the diameter. In the case of the large one that I showed you, the bowl in the platter, there was 16 facets and it was 18-inch diameter. I probably could have gone to 24. So how many flat sides do you want? In this case, this piece of wood here, and these are out of the same length of board. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's going to look about like that. This one has 16, and you can see it's got very little scallop, although I think it's an attractive looking bowl. So the question is, let's say we're going to go with the 12 on this case. So the first thing I do is I'm going to put a pen in my compass. The first thing you have to do is really draw a circle. And in this case, it's about 9 inches. And I don't know if you can see the line. I'm doing it in pen, so you'd have at least a better chance of seeing it. But I do a circle like so. And then you've got to divide into the number of angles. So 12 sides is 360 divided by 12. How many is that? 30 degrees, right? So there are a number of ways to draw the radial lines to get your space in. You could use a square. You could use something like this, which is a manual protractor. And you've got the angles here, and you just line up the line and then adjust like so. Or you can, in case of Steve, when he did his demo a couple of weeks ago, he talked about you can, if you take the radius and then go such, you can do 6 sides using the compass. And if you wanted to split, then you just find the middle point, etc. So you can use that. But this is the latest tool that I got, which is a digital protractor. It's off Amazon. It wasn't very much money. You turn it on. You make sure it's zeroed out. And then loosen it. And then I want 30 degrees. So I adjust that. And it's fairly easy to get it exactly on. It's locked on 30, you can see. And so I line up with the one side, line up with the center, and draw my line. I really like this tool. I'm a kind of gadget guy, so I really like this. It's a nice addition to my toolbox. So when you've drawn the radial lines, then you need to make it easier. What I do is I get my, that's my first mistake. That was supposed to be out. Oh, here it is. What I do is I, at the intersecting points with the circumference and the radial lines, I take an awl, a small awl like this, and I pop just a small hole at the intersection of each one. Probably more detail than you really want, but what that does, when I draw the flat sides, I put my pencil in the one hole, double check it's in the other hole, and I draw my line, like so. It really allows me to get very accurate lines, because if you don't mark these out accurately, your scallops will be uneven when you cut them and then get them on the lathe. So by some miracle, I have cut most of the sides on this one. This is again about 9 inches, 12 sides. When cutting, there are some options, good ones and bad ones. The best option, and I tried a slide-in chop saw with the wood clamped, and I can tell you it is dangerous. I almost destroyed my sliding compound saw when the wood got away and bounced around the shop. Definitely not a chop saw operation. Table saw, maybe on some kind of sled, you might be able to do it, but my experience is that the bandsaw is the best way to do this. And I'm just going to move over to the bandsaw here, so bear with me while I just move the camera. And I'm typically, I have a jet 14-inch. Typically, I would connect the two dust collector tubes to their 2 points on the saw, but for today, I don't want the dust collector making noise in the background, and I'm only going to take a couple of cuts.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
How thick is that blank?
A little over 2 inches.
Thanks.
Yeah. Important thing when cutting is accuracy, and I found that it's better to cut to the line than to cut the line. So you notice I've got my this is my security to make sure I tighten the blade tightener. It's on an orange, and when the blade is tightened like this one is, it clips on back there so that I don't start the saw with the blade loose. I've done that, and it means you have to reset the saw. You're going to get a little noise, but basically I freehand cut. I let the saw do the cutting, and I keep up against the line. Keeping the 4-inch rule by keeping my hands away. And we've cut, there's one more to cut, but I'm not going to bother to do that. And back we go. The camera is sitting on the tripod, so we're back at the table now. One of the questions is, how do we hold the work? And I use a faceplate rather than a chuck screw, and I'll just get a faceplate out.
Hey, Mike. Mike? Mike?
It is extremely important that the faceplate is centered exactly. The way I do it, this one has 8 screws, so I center the screw holes on the 4 lines there, there, and there, and I'll take that. That's 2.8 inches. That's 2.8 inches. Measure there and measure there. Then I mark the holes. I pre-drill them. I use metal screws. and then I'm ready to load it up on the lathe. In this case, I've got 1'8", and if you've got a Powermatic, you know that it's a 1 1/4 thread, but I almost always use an adapter when, and I'm going to move the camera now over to the lathe, but you can see there that I've got an adapter that takes it from the 1 1/4 to the 1 inch. I've got my PSI chuck, which I use a lot, and then we have the faceplate on there. So I'm just going to move the camera over. By the way, there's the tripod, and over on the lathe, I have a flexible cell phone holder here, and I'm going to hopefully clip that in there without messing anything up. And you should be able to see the workpiece there. We found that having the lights on is not such a good picture. It's better to have the natural light from the room. One of the things that I want to show you, and hopefully you can see, let me just move that just a tad.
Mike, how have you got your cell phone joining the meeting? Did you join it as a participant?
Yes, I came in twice, one with the cell phone and one with my laptop.
Great,
And
thank you.
see what you see on my laptop. I can also see it on the camera on the back of the phone, but it's easier to just glance at the laptop to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. So this is a low budget deal, but it seems to be working okay.
Connecting your two devices, does that use more bandwidth?
Does that what?
Does that use more bandwidth? In other words, your internet connection, does it slow it down?
No, we've got really good internet. Our usual speed is somewhere around 150 or 100 or so Mbps. So we have fairly good bandwidth. It's not an issue at all.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of other people in the house with they're on the internet at the moment anyway. So when you look at, I've turned the back of this. I didn't want to spend time just turn. So I've turned the back, a very nice, smooth curve. And my experience is that if you have a completely flat platter, there is no scallop at all. And if you have a vertical side on the platter, there is, unless it's a 4 or a 6 or an 8-sided platter, you get no scallop effect. So it's important to have about a 45-degree angle on the back of the bowl here. Can you see that? That it's a 45 angle. I'm not anal, but I sometimes will do that. I'll get my square and be at about 45 degrees. I have found that gives you the best scallop. One of the things that is critical is the thickness of the sides of the bowl, at least until you've cleared the bottom of the scallop, which is here. I've drawn a line here. This is how, when I turn inside, this is how it will look. And I'm going to have maybe an 1/8 or 3/16 of flat left. And I will turn that until I get down to that line. Now, I obviously don't draw the line when I'm doing it normally, but this is so that you can see how the scallop effect comes. And as I turn, I'll show you how the scallop starts to develop. In my case here, I've got a tenon on the back. I quite often, as I mentioned before, use mortises, but you know, Nick Ager told me when he came and stayed with me one time that I don't, as judging a piece of work, I don't want to see how you held it in the work. So in this case, I've got a tenon, and I'll either reverse it in the Longworth chuck, or sometimes I'll even just run it at this depth, run it through my drum sander, which really cleans it up nicely. But in this case, I've got a tenon rather than a mortise. All right, so typically I would wear a face shield. I've got glasses on, but it'll mess up the sound if I use a face shield. You've seen this one before. This is my safety device, a piece of wood with a magnet on the back, painted red to remind me to keep my fingers away from the edge. On a regular round bowl, it's not a big deal. But as I begin to form the scallops, it will be like a rotating saw blade. And I'll show you that a little later on. Typically, when I reverse from a faceplate, hey, sorry, was that loud?
No, Leonard is asking, when and how do you bevel the sides at 45 degrees?
It's just like turning a regular bowl. I do that first. I've got it, it's in the faceplate, reversed faceplate on the headstock, and I just turn like any other bowl, but I make the towards the periphery needs to be at 45 degrees or thereabouts.
Okay.
For the best impact. Typically, when I'm going from faceplate to chuck, I center with a cone, and I loosen up the chuck and make sure it's rotating nice and accurately. Because if you, for instance, if you use green wood and it warped while you're doing it, you would have uneven scallops. So turn down the lathe, turn it on. I'm running about, I don't know, 1,300 RPM, something like that. And I'm not going to turn the whole thing, but this cherry turns really nice. Now I'm going to turn the outside of the bowl and leave the meat. I don't know if you can see that, but I am about 1/8 of an inch from beginning to get the scallop. I'm going to switch to a smaller, my trusty Benjamin's Best, and I'm going to give me a little more room, I'm going to pull away the center, and I'm going to take out the center point as a safety. And unfortunately, I don't have a fast return on this one. I've been thinking about coming up with an idea to do that. But,
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Can you explain the red flag again?
Yeah. You mean the one on the lathe?
The one on the tool rest.
This one? Yeah. That is there because when you turn a natural edge bowl or a flat-sided vessel with scallops, this portion here is going to get quite sharp. And if you just, do one of those, reaching across to turn it off. So this prevents me from accidentally touching the edge. Like if that's what happens if I hit the red thing, it just goes against and I don't lose any fingers. And I'll show you when I've cut the scallop. This is so sharp that I think this, I use this all the time, particularly with natural edge, because the bark will rip your hands especially if I'm doing like 18-inch diameter and I have to reach across to the on-off switch. I am looking at put in an auxiliary switch at the tailstock end of the lathe, because reaching across big diameter work can be an issue. All right, let's, I'm going to actually turn the light on so I can see a little better. So I'm trying to go down in at about the same angle as the outside. Boy, this wood cut's nice. Now I'm not quite there, so I'll take another 16th. Now I'm right. In some cases, I've got a sharp point here, and in some cases, there I'm a little bit out on that one. I've got more like a 16th. So despite my desire to be accurate, it isn't as accurate as I'd like it to be, but I can deal with that. I just get a piece of sandpaper on a flat stick, and I just sand that a little bit to make an adjustment. And I'll show you how to fine tune these. So now I'm going to try and create the scallop. Now let me clean some of that out. Okay. Now we're getting fairly thin on the outside.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
can you switch the lighting again? This is not a very good look. There you go. It's much better. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Now you can you see the scallops are starting to form?
Yep.
Yeah, here you can see them a little bit less on some than others. Now this is the one where I drew the line. So you can see I want to go down to about that line. So I've still got, and I'm a little over an 1/8 thick here. So I'm going to take another couple of cuts and try and get down to that line. I'll try and do it in the dark. I'm almost there. You can see that one there, a little bit more. And the reason why, now I can show you the reason why I have this. I'll take that away. I'll fire it up. Well, let me do this first. That's sharp. I'm going to start it up. That's what happens to your finger if you touch that. It's like, it's so sharp. And when you're turning, you have to be a little bit careful or the bits will break off. But I'm almost there. I'm going to take another really fine cut. And it's important that you get your thickness right. And I'm almost there. One more. I hope it's not one too many. I love this precision kind of work. It's important that you have your wall thickness even all the way down, at least to the bottom of the scallop. And you can see now that I'm probably going to leave it at that. I mean, obviously, typically I would take this off and then I would finish turn it, but I'm not going to do that today. But I am going to, my phone is covered in, I am going to try and show you how I deal with. Now the scallops are fairly uneven and they're very thin. So I take a piece of sticky back sandpaper, put it on a fairly good sized dowel, and then I make sure you can see that. Then I carefully sand. If you go this way, you're likely to break off the sharp edges. So I go in at a bit of an angle. And this is where you can correct any errors that might be. You don't want a sharp point here because they're going to break off. So I bring it down to about the line. And then that's about a 1/16 thick there. So can you see that scallop now? Here now we've got a really nice scallop. And I do, go and do the next one and just work my way around. This one is not very deep, so I'll have to sand a little more out of it. Like so. So that, I'm going to move back to the table now. So here is what we would end up with, except that this one has 16 sides instead of the 12 that I have on the one that's on the lathe. It's that simple, guys. It's not a really complicated process. By the way, you noticed I got my Sandvik coat on today, but it has long sleeves. So from a safety issue, I cuff my sleeves with a couple of rubber bands just to make sure I don't get caught up in the workpiece. When it comes to finishing, I mean, you can do whatever you want as a finish. But my favorite is one that I got from Frank Tenta when I did his class, and that is a third pure tung oil, a third mineral spirit, and a third some form of poly. And I buy these little squirt bottles, and I put on my gloves and give it a squirt. Now you tend to try and pull it with the grain to get that nice finish. I don't like high gloss, generally speaking, but very quickly that's how I do the finishing.
Will it dry glossy like that?
Yeah, there's the, well, actually this one is the same finish with about 4 coats.
Okay.
I haven't buffed it or anything yet, so I'll probably either buff it or 4 knots wire wool, and then clean it up and then give it another wipe. But I use that finish most all the time. I've got a cupboard full of finishes, but I like this. It's very easy to apply. I don't get runs and drips and stuff because it's wipe on, wipe off. More coats, more thinner coats rather than, try and get it done in a hurry kind of coats.
That
So,
almost looks a chip and dip platter. Would that be food safe?
Yeah, well, it's any finish is food safe if it's cured properly, and that's like at least 72 hours I've read. I've made other chip and dip. This really is not intended as a chip and dip because generally the center piece is smaller, and when I do them, I put a glass dish inside the centerpiece for the dip, and then the chips are fine around the outside. In this case, this is more for some kind of snack in the middle and then something else around the outside. That was the idea. I just wanted to do something a little different out of this fantastic piece of wood. I have two blanks this size. I paid
Wow.
$100 for the piece of wood. I like the tiger wood a lot.
When you do the wipe on, wipe off, do you let it sit a bit before you wipe it, or do you wipe it right away?
I squirt it on and wipe it off just like I did, and then I leave it for a few hours, and I come back and make sure I've got a few bits in because I didn't really clean it well. I'll come back after a few hours, and I tend to put the finish on over a few days. I'm not rushing to get it out the door. Like,
Hey,
yeah,
Mike,
yeah.
you've got a whole pile of these in the corner there next to the drill press. Can we see the other ones that you've completed once again?
I think I showed them at the beginning, unless it didn't.
Well, I
come
think
out.
you did, but I don't know if you got them all.
Yeah, I mean, this was the one where I did alternate, cut aside and didn't cut aside. By the way, I've looked at, let's turn it and cut the sides afterwards. I won't be doing that again. It's really difficult to cut it accurately when you don't have a flat surface. But, you got to try things.
Did you use a beading tool for those beads, or an alternate method?
Now, in this case, for instance, the bottom of this one, I didn't show you that, but those are all hand-turned beads. I mean, this is 2015, so I was wanting to learn how to turn decent beads. These two were all hand-turned beads. I didn't know there was such a thing as a beading tool, so I did all of those by hand, with some really good instruction. And this one really only has one bead, but then I did a bunch of beads underneath. That was my beading phase, I guess.
Mike, how did you do the decorative part on the one before, on the bottom?
This one?
No, the next one.
This one?
There, yeah. How did you do?
That's multi-axis turning using, I had it on a screw chuck on the front and drilled holes in, I think, 4 different positions outside of center. And then you start in the center and you turn this one. Then you move it out and turn this one. Then move it out and turn that one. And then that one. So there are 4 axes. The tricky part, I really want to do this on the face of a bowl, but you really need a offsetting chuck, which I'm not going to invest in at the moment. But the tricky thing about this, and this is where I began to learn accuracy, is I consider myself to be a precision turner. I'm certainly not a production turner, but getting this set up flat and making sure all of these grooves are at the same level, there aren't steps. And that's quite tricky on a big diameter like this. But this was a Frank Penta item, Andy Gunning Frank Penta, a phenomenal class.
Hey, Mike,
Yep.
I think this could be a topic for another mini clinic, just how you do that. Because that's a fascinating bottom, and interesting technique. And it's a simple technique also. Right?
Yeah, it's not really complicated. You basically use a bead, like a part-off tool or a bidan to do these. But I rounded over so they didn't have sharp edges. So I went in with a bowl gouge or some kind of finishing tool and did that. It's a good technique.
I guess starting off correctly is the main thing. You have to start off absolutely accurate.
Yeah, and almost everything I turn, I know it sounds ridiculous, but when I rough turn, I rough turn to get a good finish, because I think it's really good practice for me to turn. I've been actually turning. I'll show you if we have enough time here, Bob. I guess we're up to almost an hour, but I'll show you something else my wife and I have been working on. This is my wife belongs to the New Jersey, one of the New Jersey painting groups. She's the president of the club, and they have a fundraiser every year. And this is a centerpiece for, I assume you can see it. This is a centerpiece for their annual fundraiser, and there will be one on each table. And here's what I've been doing is, here's the finished sample, but it's the theme is what's the little guy you make?
The doughboy.
Gingerbread.
Yeah, it's not the doughboy. It's the something.
Gingerbread.
Gingerbread.
And
Gumby.
so this comes apart for storage, etc. But these are made out of crappy pine. A friend of mine has a shed business, and I got all his offcuts. So I've been turning these. I've done 12 of them. They're in the other room. 12 of these and 12 of these. That's turned, and that's turned on the lathe. So this is like a piece of candy, supposedly. And my wife painted the bottom half. I painted the top half. She painted the gingerbread man. But this was really good practice for me on turning pine, which is crappy. It's also got a lot of sap in it, I might add, and turning that 12-inch diameter between centers. I learned a lot about that. Very good practice, but I tried to turn everything as if I'm trying to get a good finish, and I think it helps me when I need to get a good finish.
Hey, Mike, couple questions. Someone's asking about where you're getting your exotic woods.
I got a lot of my woods from North Carolina.
NC Woods?
No, it's international. I can't remember the name, but I can send it out. Somebody wants to know. When I lived in North Carolina, I bought a lot of. He's a wholesaler, and he opens up a couple of times a year to local clubs to go and buy stuff. The tiger wood I bought in New Hampshire when I was up for my summer break in Maine. We go up to Sanford, Maine for a week or two, and we always go to this same place in New Hampshire and buy it. Boards and beams, I go and get stuff. I tend to try and buy really nice woods when I go and get. I mean, I've got tons of, dried maple. I would say 75% of everything I turn is dry. It's most unusual for me to turn green wood. But boards and beams is the only place locally I buy it. I bought stuff from Got Wood, which is in South Carolina. And I've been there a couple of times when I've been down, when I was living down there. I went there a couple of times and loaded my truck up with stuff. But they do ship stuff. They're pretty good people to deal with.
And when you're buffing, are you using a Bevel system or something else?
Yeah, I have the Bevel system that I use on my Delta lathe. I got my Delta lathe back from the kids' camp because camp is canceled for this year. Right. So I won't be doing any classes, unfortunately. So I use the Bevel system on the small lathe. It's just, I think, as good as you can get for buffing.